Hey everybody, I am sitting here with Dr. Elmo Agatep. He is a phenomenal medical doctor and he's got a number of accolades as far as sports goes, and you've been working with the U.S. Olympic team. Tell us as much as you can tell us about that, because I know there's some top secret stuff when you work with Team USA.
Not that top secret. So I am a board certified family practice doctor. Also have added qualifications in sports medicine. I'm currently the team physician for both USA beach volleyball and also the US women's water polo team as well.
Right on.
Yeah.
Awesome. And you were slated to go to Tokyo,
Yes.
which has obviously been postponed.
Yeah.
So
So we've been dealing with that postponement and all the logistics kind of involved with that as well.
crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy. And that's really why I asked Dr. Agatep to come today, is really just to share the medical side of COVID-19 and just maybe spell out what people don't know, what they should know. It seems like the news is taking a turn every day.
Yeah.
And as good as that is, that they keep us abreast, I think sometimes too, the shock and awe of the headlines, it's confusing for people. And these are honestly scary and stressful times. So I just thought, I kind of just want to slow it down a little bit and just break this down so people can get it and kind of get your head wrapped around it, hopefully eliminate some of the stress, because I don't think stress serves your immune system very well in times when you need your immune system, right?
Yeah,
So
definitely.
what do we know about this?
So the current, that I think the vernacular that we understand this disease is the COVID-19, right, which stands for coronavirus infectious disease, and the 19 stands for the year 2019. So I've heard bandied about that there's been 18 iterations of it. It's actually the 19 stands for 2019.
Gotcha.
It's caused by a coronavirus, which is actually a fairly common virus. We have six. Prior to this one, there were 6 coronaviruses that we knew of that circulated with regularity in the community. 2 of them caused really bad illnesses, right? So we've had kind of like an indication that coronaviruses were fairly significant viruses causing respiratory disease. We've had SARS, which is it caused a really bad pulmonary infection, very similar to this one. And in fact, actually, the current name or nomenclature that we use for this one is SARS-2.
SARS-2.
Yeah, and then there was MERS, which was the Middle Eastern respiratory related disease, and that one was brief, but also quite deadly as well too. And then the 4 other types of coronaviruses actually account for about 25% of the common colds that we all get annually.
So 25% of them traditionally have kind of been from some form of coronavirus.
Yeah.
I think that's good for people to know too, maybe just to kind of take some of the hype out of it. It's been around for a while.
Yes.
And 25% of what most people would just say, hey, your child has a common cold, really has been some form of this.
Yeah, and and according to the numbers that the CDC have been giving us healthcare professionals, is that about a quarter of the colds that we get annually tend to be some form of coronavirus out there. Now, this current coronavirus actually seems to be a variant that's slightly different from those guys. And with genetic testing, it sounds like it actually arose from probably one of the animals that was being consumed in the wet markets in China, particularly the Wuhan province. They think it probably arose from a variant of coronavirus that's endemic in bats. And then it made the jump from bats to humans. And part of that reasoning is because in places like that one, they're so intimately in contact with their livestock that unfortunately it makes those jumps. So we call that a zoonosis. So it's a transference of an infectious agent from an animal to a different species. And from there, because this virus is so novel that our immune system had no defense against it, and it quickly spread. And unfortunately, because of that spread, and because of it being such a novel virus, our immune system just didn't know how to deal with it. So instead of actually having specialized cells that can actually fight off the infection really easily, think of like a special ops group, right? So you have a SWAT team that can knock down an infection really easily. Unfortunately, because this is such a novel virus, our immune system just didn't have that SWAT team available. So what it does, it drops kind of a nuclear bomb on it. And unfortunately, the collateral damage is all the inflammation that then triggers pneumonia, that causes basically the severe respiratory disease that we call ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome.
I love it. because I think that's a perfect analogy and kind of sets the stage, a good metaphor for people to understand too, the fact that there's been different strands, right? So also there's a good possibility people have been exposed to one of the strands in the past. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so we're still doing some genetic work to see whether or not there's been some exposure. Some of the early theories on why actually children don't seem to be as affected or as adversely affected by the disease is that because kids are oftentimes exposed to coronaviruses so commonly, they get colds, yeah, so frequently that their immune system already had some form of immunity to this.
I think that's good for parents to know too, right? Like there's a possibility their child's had some exposure to something, let's just call it similar, that the body at least has a defense system in place.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's key because a lot of people are like deathly afraid of, and then you go, wow, there's been different variations over time. This is certainly a variant that's more powerful. But at the same time, the body's reaction when you call the bomb, break that down a little bit. Even if you get into some of the cell biology, what is that? Just so people, I think, understand what the massive inflammation is.
Yeah. So oftentimes, when we encounter an agent that the body deems to be not part of it, right? So be it bacteria or virus or even allergens, the body then enacts a whole bunch of processes that kind of triggers alarms. That then sets off like responses from the cells to fight off that infection, right? And some of those alarm systems are actually chemicals that the body then that the immune cells secrete in response to that, to encountering that virus or that bacteria. In cases like where we get exposed to novel viruses like the coronavirus that we have going on right now, it sets off a storm. We call it a cytokine storm. So cytokines basically are chemicals produced by the immune system. They're kind of like an SOS, that's the body the cell system. I mean, it's it's like a cell phone system, right?
I love it. I was hoping you would go there too, because the cytokine storm is really what it is, right? It is a storm. It is like the bomb went off and the inflammation goes with it, but it's your body basically launching an all-out assault.
Yeah.
And is this similar to like an allergic attack?
It can be, and you could almost deem like an anaphylactic reaction similar to this.
Almost like
one.
an overreaction.
Yeah, it's an overreaction to something that probably, that in patients who've had experience fighting it off in the past would not be as severe.
And as we look at this from the standpoint of the cytokine storm, that's really what a big allergic reaction is. Your body launching an all-out assault. It's giving it everything it's got. And then some of the side effects would be things that really affect the lung, because this is a respiratory illness and it should be taken seriously. If someone's got it, it can really depress systems within the body. And because your body's giving all the energy to attack it, it really kind of locks up the immune system. And also you can see things on x-rays in the lungs when it's been really severe. Is that right?
Yeah, so the cytokine storm is kind of like a hyper response by the immune system, right? It's ringing all the alarm bells. It's calling to play all the available immune reactions into play to fight off this virus. Unfortunately, because of that severe reaction, the collateral damage is bigger, right?
So talk about that collateral damage, because I think a lot of people need to understand too, some of the symptoms associated with this are really the body's own reaction.
Yeah, so some of the collateral damage to, and the symptoms that we have actually are brought on by that immune response, right? So the fever is triggered by cytokines. So what it's trying to do is raise the body temperature, right? We know at a certain level, if the temperature gets too hot, the virus itself actually is rendered pretty useless. Right?
So when the body pitches a fever, it's a healthy response.
Yeah.
And what it's doing is it's cooking up the temperature too high to basically kill off.
Yeah, what it does, it suppresses basically viral production. It leads to the denaturing of the virus. So it's kind of like, denaturization is kind of like when you take an egg white and you put it into a hot plate, right? Then it basically breaks down and you have, instead of like a translucent fluid, you have, protein that's turned white because it's kind of broken down, right?
And that's what your body's doing. Your innate intelligence is basically cooking up, heating up the virus so it can't reproduce. It's a good response.
It's an adaptive response that we've developed over time, over evolution, right? So that's one of the responses. The same thing with like body aches and the shivers and the
Talk me
chills.
through body aches and shivers.
Yeah, with chills, we think that's actually one way the body actually um, increases core temperature, right? So it triggers basically your body to your muscles to contract repetitively and unconsciously. So what it does when the muscle starts to actually contract repetitively and through the shivers, it generates more body heat. So it kind of raises your core temperature. The chills seems to be it arises from like those cytokines actually going into your temperature regulation center in the brain, and it lowers kind of like that your perception of like temperature, so you feel cold. That's where the chills come from.
So that's the cytokines going to the brain
Mm-hmm.
to give you the chills. So it gives the perceived
Perception that you're cold, so you start to shiver, but core temperature starts to rise as a result of that one. The body aches is still kind of like, we have some idea where that comes from, but there's still a lot of theory of why that happens as well too. But we believe cytokines are responsible for that one as well too. And then there's the pulmonary responses, right? So some of these cytokines lead to increased blood flow to the area to try to recruit more cells to get to there. And then also the blood vessels, as they dilate, they also become leaky, right? So what happens is that with the leakiness of the blood vessels, the cells responsible for the immune response is able to leave circulation and get to the area where the infection's at. But unfortunately, what happens is fluid also leaks out. So the lung then starts to fill with your own bodily fluid, right? And when that happens, the lung becomes stiffer. It's kind of like a sponge picking up more water, right? So it becomes less pliable. It's harder for the person to breathe. And then as that fluid builds up in the lungs, it starts to fill up the little air sacs in your lungs with fluid. So it's harder for you to fill those air sacs with oxygen, so you feel like you're drowning. And that's actually the perception that patients have when they get really severe respiratory disease, due to the coronavirus, is that they have that feeling of, I can't get my lungs to inflate enough. I can't get enough air in. I feel like I'm drowning. I feel fatigued because I can't get enough oxygen in. And eventually, as disease progresses, it leads to respiratory failure and then cardiac failure. And that's where the majority of like the complications and the mortality involved with coronavirus infections are happening.
It's from the lungs and then eventually the heart.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me ask you this, because you do such a good job of explaining this, and also I think just kind of putting people at ease, understanding that cascade and that cytokine storm. It almost like spills one into the next, which is the cascade. At some point, if a fever is too high, whether it's a number or a range you want to give me, what would you say is too high and people maybe shouldn't let the fever run anymore?
Of course, yeah. So I mean, there isn't like a true number that we recommend that patients kind of try to seize their fever. And oftentimes it's I mean, of course, if it gets higher than 102.5, then we definitely tell patients you might want to consider to bring that fever down. Because when it gets too high, then of course other bodily functions start to shut down, from the brain to the kidneys. Those can be all affected by extreme temperatures as well too.
And we've probably heard it said before that, the fever broke, or, last night I had the shivers and the sweats and I finally broke the fever. If you were to put that into medical terms, what's really going on there? Because I'm sure we've all seen this with our own children, with, patients that we've had. It's just one of those things. There is such a thing where people will break through. What is happening there?
Oftentimes it's a cessation of the fluid immune response, right? So as the immune system finally is able to get hold of the virus or the bacterial infection, that cytokine storm starts to die down. And as that dies down, then the responses that those cytokines enacted, the fever, the chills, that starts to also break as well too. So as those symptoms start to reduce, that's when the patients get that subjective feeling that, oh yeah, the fever finally broke, and I start to feel better. So colloquially, we call it, fever breaking, but oftentimes biochemically, it's the reduction of the immune response to the virus. But part of it is because now that there is, there is a reduction of like the infection.
Right. Yeah. So for any moms watching, they would recognize that, right? Like colloquially, they say, the fever broke, and they go, well, just means you're on the other side of it. Health is going to be restored. So there is something to the body pitching a fever, and maybe giving, overreacting with things to control the body isn't the best thing. Let your body pitch the fever. Let your body, do its natural defenses. Shivering isn't something that's a bad thing. It's a body's natural response. Even the ability to, people being tired and wanting to sleep more. Well, your body's saving energy, right? So these are all natural responses that I think is super key. But I want to kind of take a turn in the story here because you have some firsthand accounts, not just as a doctor, but you've actually had COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, I did get a lot of the symptoms that we would attribute to it. The testing was still at the time fairly limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the test to this day, it's still about 70% sensitive only. But yeah,
What does that mean, 70% sensitive?
So it would pick up, the sensitivity means that it describes the test ability to pick up a positive test, basically. And there's a trade-off, right? So the more sensitive you make the test, the more likely you are to get false findings, right? So, and then we call that specificity, meaning that the test's ability to detect what it's supposed to detect, right? So the more sensitive you make it, the less specific the test gets, right? So they're trying to find a fine line between that one. So currently we know from the data that's been published about this test that from like nasal swabs, you get about 63% sensitivity. And as far as like oral swab, it goes down about like 38%. So there's still kind of like a rate of error with the test. So
what would that rate of error be about?
So in between, like it's about 70 to about 50% like sensitive. I mean, those are rough numbers, and I'd probably say I'm not quoting, published articles about it, but I know.
I think that's important for people to know too, is like, hey, just because something comes back positive, this is still a new test. This thing is, again, developing day by day. Just take that into consideration.
Yeah. So the discussion that we've had with patients is that if you do have a positive test, most likely you have it. But if you do have a negative test, it doesn't completely rule it out either. It's a good test to rule in, but it's not a good test to rule out. Because in fact, there's many anecdotal cases that have been published that show that, we've had patients test negative for it, but then after recurrent testing, because they remain symptomatic, after about 3 to 4 repetitive tests, that they end up positive for it. And so us in clinic, what we say is that if you do have the true symptoms of it, that consider yourself positive. And that's kind of like what happened to me. I developed what felt like, the fatigue, the chills, the low-grade fever. So I had a temperature of 100.7. So I decided to go into the clinic, get tested for influenza, because we could do that benchtop right in the clinic, as well as the strep test. And both tests came back negative. A second test the following couple of days for another flu test, just to make sure that it was truly negative, was also negative. And I started to develop high fevers. It started to climb to the 101s, the 102s, and I maxed out at 104.7.
104.7.
Yeah, with severe body chills and body aches, extreme fatigue, which then evolved into like difficulty breathing. I couldn't even walk up a flight of stairs without stopping for a short, for a breath. I couldn't feel like I couldn't get a deep breath in. And this continued for about 12 to 15 days. And finally, after speaking to friends who were infectious disease specialists and virologists, pretty much they said that consider yourself COVID positive. So I kind of took myself out of rotation and was at home recovering. And the recovery part was pretty horrendous. I don't think I've ever been that sick before.
Okay. What were some of the things that you would advise people, or maybe just things that are known once you're sick, what they can do? What would be helpful?
Yeah. So a lot of, unfortunately, where our helplessness as healthcare professionals at this point is for patients with mild to moderate disease, is that it's the current recommendation, because we don't have medications to coronavirus that are published and proven to be truly effective, is that we tell patients to quarantine and isolate, and supportive measures are super important, right? So making sure that you hydrate very well, eat
hydration,
hydration, resting, not pushing yourself too hard, making sure that you eat properly as well too. So get your nutrition in. And I know when people are sick, they just don't want to take in anything. Proper nutrition is a great medication for this.
And things like, some of the building blocks for the immune system. So vitamin A, vitamin D, obviously vitamin C is huge preventatively, but also, giving your body, staying away from sugars. Would you say that would be?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a very good recommendation for anybody who wants to stay healthy, right? Like cutting down on processed foods, I call it basically limiting the chain of custody, right? The less people touch your food, the more likely it is to be actually healthier. And making sure that you cut down on like processed sugars, getting like all your important elements in. And if you're unable to do that one, sometimes maybe using a multivitamin could be also helpful.
Sure.
I'm definitely I ascribe to some of the evidence that shows that vitamin C and zinc tend to be very helpful during periods of illnesses. So I add that on to my regimen as well too.
Cool.
But definitely the big ones are hydration, resting, and quarantining yourself.
Simple, right? And also a survivor. So it's one of those things. I don't want people to overreact either, and they have a positive test or think they have it, and then think it's a death sentence, because we've had some
Yes.
questions on that. Is it over? Should I get my affairs in order? Well, try rest first, and it's just one of those that go, oh, but at the same time, I think there's some key points in the way we describe it is be hard to kill,
Yes.
and it's always about keeping the host so that your body is healthy. And like you said, these are things to do whether you're ill or not, like
Yeah.
eating proper food and not having processed sugars, just good in general. So what you can control, I want to put the spotlight on that. As wellness champions, what we do is we do virtual workshops, and we can teach you things, whether you're working at home or remotely, that you can do if you are in quarantine, if you are exposed to people, maybe you're a first-time responder. We've got some firefighters who go, hey, this is good anytime. So be hard to kill, meaning have your body healthy so that no matter what you come in contact with, it's not going to be the thing that takes you down. There are variables at play, and control as much of that as possible. So if you want, go to the Wellness Champion site and we can give you some more information. We have doctors that will be happy to do those virtual workshops and teach you a little more specifically where there's some Q&A. But I love your genius on this. I love the expertise and also being candid to share your personal experience, because I think it's really important for people to understand you don't want to get it.
Yeah.
Right? You don't.
Yeah.
And if you do, you can get through it. And as much as the infectious disease is what Dr. Agatep deals with, a lot of what we talk about is the wellness side, kind of further upstream to just keep people, cognizant of what's going on there. But look, washing your hands regularly and not touching your face and nose is a good thing anytime, right? The idea that you have healthy organic foods as much as possible is good anytime. Processed sugar, flours, over 50% of your immune system's in your gut. So if you're loading your body up with bad food and things that aren't good for you, that's going to decrease your response. But also understand there's things that you can do on a regular basis that would make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, and to dovetail into that conversation, going into this one, like you said, you mentioned, make yourself hard to kill, right? Health is supremely important, especially coming into this crisis. And part of it too, if you look at the mortality data about it, there's a lot of data that shows that actually patients with coexisting high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, asthma, pulmonary issues, people who vape or smoke, they tend to have higher mortality rates. And in fact, actually, they comprise a majority of the people who've died from this disease. And if you look at actually the data on people who survived it, they tend to be people who actually were fit when they first came in.
Right.
So
it's what you and I would call comorbidities.
Yes.
But explain maybe some behaviors that this is a good time for people to drop. In other words, what are some unhealthy habits that would be smart to get rid of? You mentioned vaping, smoking.
Yeah.
And I know this is obvious, but it becomes really important now. Your life's at risk that you drop those bad habits because it leaves you susceptible. What are some other comorbidities?
Yeah, in fact, actually, to kind of press on the data about vaping, and if you look at the data on who's passed away from the disease, the United States is slightly different because we're also seeing younger patients actually passing away from the disease, whereas in China, the data showed that a majority of people were over the age of 50 and 60, 70, right? In the United States, it looks like about 40% of the people are less than 40 years old. And in fact, actually, one of the things that we surmise maybe contributing to that one is the use of vape products in the younger generation. So that in itself plays a big role. And in fact, actually, I really encourage everybody who is out there vaping or thinking about it, not to do it. This is a great time to get off of it. Other health behaviors definitely would be, eating a much more, a plant-based diet that's less processed, getting your 8 hours of sleep every day, staying active during this period, and managing your stress. Those are actually 4 things I frequently prescribe in my clinic as medications for my patients, right? 4 basic things: managing your stress, being active, getting your 8 hours of sleep, and eating a plant-based diet.
Absolutely.
And those things, and then everything else should dovetail into that.
Right on. And in our community, we've got a number of patients we co-manage or we'll see for different reasons back and forth. And that's what I love about this conversation is it just kind of comes back to basics and nobody can really argue with that. But I would also say, hey, this is a positive time to make a positive change in your health. Take these things that are on the horizon and say, I don't want to be a part of that. I'm going to make some hard decisions and get away from those things that ultimately can cost you big time. So check out the Wellness Champion site. And if you want to be hard to kill, we got some facts and some details. And we have a number of docs all over the globe that will do this virtually. They're virtual workshops, but they can do some Q&A. You can ask some questions from yourself quarantined to the docs and just get really specific on it. But as always, I appreciate you sharing and thank you for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure.